First of all, I'd like to thank Stephen Cullenberg and all of the organizers of this conference for having invited me to speak at one of the plenaries. It's wonderful to see so many people who associate themselves with the Marxist tradition, and especially so many young people. And of course, the recent defeats and disarray have meant that many people assume that capitalism has achieved a stage of permanence. And this conference is suggesting that the party indeed is not over. I've been asked to talk about class and the prison industrial complex. And I want to begin by saying that the vexed histories of Marxist theories and praxis in the US over the last 3 decades have traversed in complex ways fervent attempts to make categories like race, gender, sexuality conversant with the Marxist category of class. And of course, Cedric Robinson's recently republished Black Marxism, and I recommend it to all of you, but of course you should have read it already. Cedric Robinson examines the central role of Marxism in the formation of Black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James. But I want to first comment on the prevailing assumption regarding Dr. Martin Luther King's understanding of anti-capitalist struggles, that it wasn't until the end of his life that he began to broaden his conceptualization of the movement for Black equality beyond civil rights and began to think globally and in terms of class struggle. Dr. King gave a very interesting tribute to Du Bois immediately after his death, and I want to share that with you. We cannot talk of Dr. Du Bois, he said, without recognizing that he was a radical all of his life. Some people would like to ignore the fact that he was a communist in his later years. And then King goes on to say, it is worth noting that Abraham Lincoln warmly welcomed the support of Karl Marx during the Civil War and corresponded with him freely. In contemporary life, and this was of course in the 60s, the English-speaking world has no difficulty with the fact that Sean O'Casey was a literary giant of the 20th century and a communist, or that Pablo Neruda is generally considered the greatest living poet, though he served in the Chilean Senate as a communist. It is time, Dr. King concludes, to cease muting the fact that Dr. Du Bois was a genius and chose to be a communist. Our irrational, obsessive anti-communism has led us into too many quagmires to be retained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. Now, today it appears that this irrational, obsessive anti-communism may have begun to atrophy as the memory of a socialist community of nations recedes, but I think it has been replaced by an irrational, obsessive affirmation of capitalism. And as a matter of fact, and I'll say this to Doug because of your references, I was driving to the airport Thursday evening, the San Francisco airport, and I saw this gigantic billboard, reddish pink billboard with enormous words, "Capitalism served fresh daily," by Forbes, that is. But I was also listening to the news. I had been listening, for the traffic information, and I was listening to one of those all-news stations, and precisely at the moment that I saw the billboard, the news reporter announced a new report about the discrepancy between wages and available housing in the Bay Area. And apparently in the San Francisco Bay Area, in order to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, one must now earn $28 an hour, or as much on the stock market. We're all now invited to join the capitalist party. Even some children, as Gayatri Spivak pointed out yesterday afternoon. No one who makes minimum wage can afford an apartment any longer. And so, listening to that report, I thought about the welfare-to-work programs across the country, and it occurred to me that a single mother with a family to support will now have to move to Nebraska in order to be assured of housing. Otherwise, she may very well end up in one of the country's new women prisons. But that's an aside. I want to engage for a moment in some more historical reflections, and I guess I'm allowed to do this since most of the time I get associated with a particular historical era, although I try hard to point out that this is the year 2000. Right? And many people introduce themselves to me by saying I come from the 60s. As if it were a place that one could return to. But speaking of the 60s, during the height of the Black liberation movement, prominent leaders like James Forman, for example, influenced as they were by such figures as Frantz Fanon and Régis Debray, argued against what was called at the time reactionary nationalism. And Forman, for example, I remember a Black youth conference in, I believe, 1967, in which he gave a talk arguing that the prevailing skin analysis needed to be complemented with a class analysis. And of course, with respect to gender, during that same period, socialist feminism emerged as a theoretical and activist category that indicated a critical relationship to Marxian frameworks that was not primarily about inserting gender into a theoretical milieu fundamentally informed by class, but it was about troubling the masculinization of class, the masculinist conceptualizations of class. And this may be the year 2000, but there still is a great deal of troubling to be done in that respect. Even as intersectional analyses have become increasingly sophisticated, and what Kobena Mercer has called the requisite mantra of race, class, and gender is incorporated into our thinking and our practices, class has tended to drop out. The gender and race analysis, often originally designed to both trouble and deepen class analysis, have frequently tended to displace or replace class. And I mean, I just have to say this. As much as we try to contest this, it seems that the dominant assumption remains that class is the province of white men. I just had to say that. But of course, this conference takes place in the aftermath of two major demonstrations against the effects of globalization, which brought a much needed sense of revitalization and hope to radical activists and thinkers. Those demonstrations served, for example, to highlight the anti-sweatshop campaign, especially as that campaign in turn highlights gender and points to its connection with immigrants' rights, the immigrants' rights movement, as very specific ways in which organizing is directly engaging with the structures of class in the era of globalization and its cross-cutting relations to gender and race. Of course, another important presence in the recent demonstrations has been the movement against the prison industrial complex. And the question I want to focus on this evening is how an analysis of the prison industrial complex helps us to systematically incorporate this category of class into our theoretical understandings and our activism. But I also want to suggest that thinkers like Herbert Marcuse and Cedric Robinson, Avery Gordon, and their critical appropriations of Marxian ideas help us to rethink the value of utopian imagination at a time when it is as difficult to imagine a world without prisons as it is to imagine a world without capitalism. The context of the ideological struggle confronting us is one that has been shaped by the ease with which we have embraced in both scholarly and popular frameworks the designation underclass, and the rapidity with which it conceptually devours and racializes ever larger groups of women and men should give us cause to rethink the Marxian categories that have historically served to explain the material and ideological expulsion of ever larger numbers of people from the working class. Historically, many of the debates surrounding the relationship between state-sanctioned punishment and radical social movements have focused on the place of the lumpen proletariat in Marx's ideas about class. Of course, Fanon insisted that the lumpen proletariat was a key to the success of the Algerian Revolution, and this was wielded against Marx's dismissal of what he called the refuse of all classes. But advocates of the lumpen, and I could mention some names, Eldridge Cleaver, for example, failed to grasp the reason why Fanon argued for the organizing of the lumpen proletariat. Cleaver's argument was that only the unemployed, including and especially prisoners, were entirely outside of the capitalist system of production, and as outsiders, they alone were capable of effectively challenging the system. Of course, a decidedly non-Marxist position. However, Fanon argued with Marx that the lumpen proletariat could be easily transformed into collaborators with colonialism, and for that reason alone needed to be organized. And I'm quoting from The Wretched of the Earth: if this available reserve of human effort is not immediately organized by the forces of rebellion, it will find itself fighting as hired soldiers side by side with the colonial troops. Parenthetically, but not insignificantly, neither Marx nor Fanon nor Cleaver envisioned the lumpen proletariat as gendered. Consequently, the implications of this potential counter-revolutionary on the one hand or revolutionary force on the other hand, the implications of it being constituted as a masculine force could never be addressed. But what about class in this contemporary era of the prison industrial complex? The prison industrial complex is a relatively new concept, which I didn't really help to originate. It was, I think, Mike Davis who originated the notion, and I thought Mike would be here this evening, but I was
not here though.
So I wanted to ask him. But in 1995, he wrote an article in The Nation on a prison in California, Calipatria Prison, and the title of that article was "Hell Factories in the Field, a Prison Industrial Complex." And according to Mike Davis, an emergent prison industrial complex increasingly rivals agribusiness as the dominant force in the life of rural California and competes with land developers as the chief seducer of legislators in Sacramento. It has become a monster that threatens to overpower and devour its creators, and its uncontrollable growth ought to rattle a national consciousness now complacent at the thought of a permanent prison class. Now, 2 years ago, a group of scholars and activists, as Stephen pointed out, organized a conference at UC Berkeley, which was entitled "Critical Resistance Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex." Mike Davis was a major presenter at that conference. And as a matter of fact, two of the organizers, Ruth Gilmore, who teaches at UC Berkeley, and Dylan Rodriguez, who is finishing his degree there, are presenting here at Rethinking Marxism 2000. When we began to organize that conference, one of our major tasks was to encourage the popularization of the term prison industrial complex. We were of the opinion that a shift in the language used to discuss the expanding prison system would have the effect of encouraging a multi-pronged analysis that would involve, and I'll list some of the components of that analysis. First of all, the political economy of prisons, and Ruth Gilmore has a forthcoming book on the political economy of California prisons. Second of all, the place of prisons in the global economy. Number three, the political, social, and cultural implications of a rapidly growing population of prisoners. 2 million people are in prison now. 150,000 of them are women. The overwhelming majority of them are people of color. That is to say, Black people, Latinos, increasing numbers of Asians, Native Americans. As a matter of fact, I think Native Americans have the highest per capita rate of imprisonment. Number four, a new vocabulary with which to imagine a social landscape no longer dominated by prisons. And number five, and these are in no particular order, the role of gender in shaping a prison population overdetermined by race and class. And number six, the role of prisoners. The role of prisoners as subjects and objects of social change. And this is something that Dylan Rodriguez addresses in his work. Last spring, I took part in a research group sponsored by the University of California Humanities Research Center, a research group on the prison industrial complex. And some of the participants included Ruth Gilmore, Nancy Shepper Hughes, David Goldberg, Gina Dent, Avery Gordon. One of the central texts we decided to read was, or rather reread, was Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall et al. And so this evening I want to return to the last chapter of, it sounds like I'm giving a sermon, you know, chapter and verse. But I do want to turn to the last chapter for the insights I think we can cull regarding ways of thinking about class struggles deeply inflected by race and gender in this era of the prison industrial complex. And so I want to quote somewhat extensively from a passage in chapter 9 which contextualizes that oft-cited phrase, race is the modality in which, come on now, this is Rethinking Marxism 2000. Race is the modality in which class is lived. And then, of course, there's the other version, gender is the modality in which race is lived. But let me quote this passage. Race is intrinsic to the manner in which the black laboring classes are complexly constituted at the economic, political, and ideological levels. Race enters into the way black labor, male and female, is distributed as economic agents on the level of economic practice, and the class struggles which result from it. Into the way the fractions of the black laboring class are constituted as a set of political forces in the theater of politics and the political struggle which results, and in the manner in which that class is articulated as the collective and individual subjects of emergent ideologies and forms of consciousness, and the struggle over ideology, culture, and consciousness which results. This gives the matter of race and racism a theoretical as well as practical centrality to all the relations and practices which affect black labor. Race is the modality in which class is lived. It is also the medium in which class relations are experienced. This does not immediately heal any breaches or bridge any chasms, but it has consequences for the whole class, whose relation to their conditions of existence is now systematically transformed by race. It determines some of the modes of struggles. It also provides one of the criteria by which we measure the adequacy of struggle to the structures it aims to transform. I don't really have time to consider how an account of the impact of the prison system at each of these levels, economic, political, ideological, would create significant shifts in the way in which we think about and organize around class issues. But I do want to suggest that the imprisonment of 2 million bodies demands that we examine the adequacy of struggles that do not take into consideration that criminalization is a routine mode of racialization today, and that it has profound effects on the constitution of the working class. The authors of Policing the Crisis conclude their extensive study of the moral panic over mugging with a warning that it is important, urgent even, to engage in practice with the, quote, economic, political, and ideological conditions producing crime, and which thus produce a racialized sector of the class which is being systematically driven into crime. But we should not mistake, the authors argue, a proto-political consciousness for organized political struggle and practice. And I should say parenthetically that the notion of crime is one that is constructed. Crime is not something objective. I mean, that's what the whole book is about in examining mugging. The point they make in the very last pages of Policing the Crisis is that even in those organizations, like the Black Panther Party of the early 60s and of the late 60s and early 70s, even those organizations that have seen the wageless as their primary constituency have achieved only limited successes. And the authors conclude that, and I quote again, "There is as yet no active politics, no form of organized struggle, and no strategy which is able adequately and decisively to intervene in the quasi-rebellion of the black wageless, such as would be capable of bringing about that break in the current false appropriations of oppression through crime, that critical transformation of the criminalized consciousness into something more sustained and thoroughgoing in a political sense." Of course, this was the unfinished and perhaps then unrealizable task undertaken by George Jackson. The formulation by the authors of Policing the Crisis precisely echoes Jackson's own words. This is one of the issues that Dylan Rodriguez takes up in his work on prisoner discourse. Recent collections of prisoners' writings, Belle Chevigny's volume and Bruce Franklin's volume, as well as writings by prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal, may not accomplish this transformation, but they do provide alternative knowledges of the punishment system. The social space of the prison is accessible to the public primarily through the scholarly and popular discourses associated with social scientific disciplines such as criminology and sociology. Because common sense ideas regarding imprisonment tend to rely on the well-rehearsed statistical information linking rising rates of incarceration to penal strategies that putatively minimize crime. Because of this, more complicated conversations regarding the place of punishment in U.S. society tend to be relegated to a marginal status. Many of these conversations are happening within prison, among prisoners. And if you look at Bruce Franklin's anthology of prison literature in the 20th century, Franklin uses prison writing to construct a kind of insider history of U.S. prisons. Belle Chevigny, in her volume, which is entitled Doing Time, Chevigny's approach is more sociological. She organizes prisoner writings around themes like time and routines and racism, work, family, writing, and views of the outside world. Her collection represents prison both as an aberrant social formation with its totalitarian character and attendant brutality, and at the same time as a stable community of individuals who try to lead relatively normal lives. And as the writing itself is produced within and attests to the tensions between these two opposing representations of imprisonment, the anthology tends to be both an expose of the institution and, at the same time, an unwitting affirmation of its permanence. But this isn't the fault of the anthology, nor of its contributors. Indeed, some of the most powerful pieces reveal that even as we are tempted to think about prison in the simplistic terms with which it is represented in popular discourse, do the crime, do the time, for example, the complicated social relations within the prison indicate the extent to which this institution, designed to sever its inhabitants from the larger society, is more closely tied to that society than we would imagine. For example, Susan Rosenberg's short story, entitled Lee's Time, evokes the pervasive sexual coercion that is a defining feature of women's prisons, further complicated by the racism that remains linked to structures of state punishment, which isn't to say that sexual violence is not also linked to structures of state punishment. Indeed it is. But in the instance of this short story, a white prisoner reflects on the way racism troubles the hierarchy of guard and prisoner. The legacy of George Jackson's attempts to transform criminal consciousness into a more productive political consciousness is still very much alive among many of the men and women who inhabit the space of the prison. As a matter of fact, prison is a place that is very much connected to the past. And if you've ever been into a prison, and if you've ever read descriptions of prisons in the early 20th century or the late 19th century, you find it remarkable that while there have been many changes in a fundamental way, very little has changed. But in connection with the Critical Resistance Conference I was referring to, we received thousands of letters from prisoners who wanted to participate in the conference, prisoners who wanted to add their ideas to our efforts to develop a critique of the prison industrial complex. And as a matter of fact, I learned that very recently on Black Solidarity Day. When is Black Solidarity Day? Well, we don't celebrate it on the West Coast, but I know in New York. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does anybody? When is it? No, it's not in February. It's not.
Juneteenth?
Okay, well, anyway, on Black Solidarity Day, interestingly enough, prisoners at Sing Sing in New York organized a session conducted by the prisoners themselves, entitled The Prison Industrial Complex. And I happened to find one of the talks delivered at that section on the internet. But the point I want to make in this presentation as I move toward my conclusion is that class solidarity has never been an easy task. The historical presence of racism and male dominance within the labor movement attests to that. But it is even more difficult to think about solidarity with prisoners. And especially prisoners, men and women alike, who, despite their imprisonment, continue to be involved in the productive process. Prison labor is one important ingredient of the prison industrial complex, although it is certainly not its defining feature. An increasing proportion of the $50 billion corrections budget goes to private corporations. And I believe the criminal justice budget, if we want to look at the entire criminal justice budget, it's approximately $150 billion, very rapidly approaching the magnitude of the defense budget. According to Joel Dyer, there are now 18 telephone companies competing for the prison market. And they generate $1 billion on prison phone calls alone. He points out that one pay telephone in a prison can generate $15,000 a year. Collect phone calls that prisoners make to their generally very poor relatives. But as Daya and others have pointed out, one of the most revealing aspects of the market-driven punishment industry is the emergence of an industry called prisoner brokering. And during Doug Henwood's presentation about all of these activities that used to be performed without generating profit, I thought about this new business called prisoner brokering, where entire companies generate enormous profits simply by finding cells for prisoners' bodies from one end of the country to another. And he points out in his book that he spent, I think, one day making telephone calls, finding out where, I don't know whether he was posing as a broker, but he spent one day making telephone calls and did work that would have amounted to over $400,000 in profit, finding cells for prisoners. During this last section of my presentation, I want to raise some questions to return to the theme of prison labor. I want to raise some questions regarding the relationship between the labor unions and prison labor. We know that in the 1970s, around the time of the Attica Rebellion, serious efforts were undertaken to organize unions, particularly in California prisons. But what about today? Considering the state of the labor movement today and the declining proportion of U.S. workers who are union members, I believe that we've hit the lowest percentage since the industrial unions began to organize during the 1930s. I mean, considering that it would seem that any drive to organize the unorganized needs to take up the issue of organizing prisoners. Any drive to organize the unorganized needs to take up the issue of organizing prisoners. At the last convention of UE, United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers, at their last convention, a resolution was passed bearing the title, Curb the Prison Industrial Complex. And they point out in the resolution that, quote, this enormous and growing prison population represents a huge pool of cheap labor that directly threatens the wages and conditions of those of us who work on the outside of the walls. While they acknowledge that at present only a relatively small percentage of prisoners are employed by private corporations, they go on to say that states' selling of prison labor to private companies at the cost of jobs on the outside is not unlike forcing former welfare recipients into workfare jobs that in many cases were held by non-prison union workers. The abuse of prisoner labor by private corporations is also the moral and practical equivalent of NAFTA. Like the labor parties and unions of earlier generations, we must declare loudly and firmly that as free workers, we will not be forced to compete with the unfree. Now let me finish, because they make 5 demands, and I just want to very briefly go through those demands. They resolve that the convention calls on the Congress to prohibit the use of prison labor by private companies for private profit, that the displacement of private or public sector workers by prison labor be strictly prohibited, that criminal penalties be imposed on companies making use of inmate labor for purposes related to strike breaking, and they demand that until use of prison labor for profit is prohibited, all such labor performed by inmates be compensated at no less than the prevailing wages and benefits. And the resolution urges that prisoners participating in work programs be covered by workers' compensation and occupational safety and health laws and receive Social Security credit. Now, of course, now I'm at the beginning of a new talk, which would closely examine the implications of this resolution. But suffice it to say that it marks an important beginning, even with its deeply ambivalent posture with respect to class solidarity, reflective, I might add, of a similar ambivalence with respect to workers in the southern countries within the context of globalization. The resolution fails to consider the implications of labor performed directly for the state as opposed to labor for private corporations. It is hesitant to name race, except in the historical context of references to the post-slavery convict lease system, and it stops short of calling upon the union to organize the unorganized who do not live in the free world. But such a position would necessitate a very different notion of who counts as working class. And such a position would require us to assume the abolitionist stance of imagining a world without prisons. Thank you. Yay.